Welcome to this webinar that's exploring changes to HEIF and in particular looking at those changes through the lens of public engagement. I'm Paul Manners, co-director of the National Coordinating Centre for Public Engagement, and in preparing for this event we invited people who'd booked to come to share their questions with us, and this slide is just a summary of the key issues that people identified as wanting more help with, and they will help structure the rest of what we'll be covering today. Is HEIF really changing, or is it just the language? Where does public and community engagement now sit, and how safe is it? How do we evidence economic contribution without undermining the values of engagement? What arguments, metrics and examples actually work in practice? And we'll end just thinking about how institutions collectively can kind of make the case still for high value public engagement. The first question that people asked was, what is actually changing? Is it just the language? And I think the very clear answer to that is no, it is not just the language. There is a significant shift going on, I think, in research and innovation funding policy driven by UKRI. And many of you will be familiar with this articulation of their mission, which has been shared recently: advancing knowledge, improving lives, driving growth. And growth sits there as part of the story. HEIF is driving towards growth, but that's the context in which we need to understand the shifts. And we'll come back to this later, but I think it's worth emphasizing this is a structural shift in the ways that research and innovation is being framed and described, and it is different. So the next slide shows perhaps something we might all be familiar with, which was how HEIF used to describe the kinds of activities that were funded. There are 7 kind of different areas, all of which were deemed to be part of the knowledge exchange portfolio, including bottom right, supporting community and public engagement. And they were expressed in this way for many years. What's different about the way that the HEIF guidance is being expressed now is it's no longer looking at a set of activities sitting alongside each other. It's inviting a much clearer logic that drives towards economic growth on the right. So this very simple high-level logic model sits at the heart of the guidance, and it starts over on the left with the activities that might underpin knowledge exchange. In the middle it has 4 mechanisms, and on the right it talks about economic growth. So it's definitely moving from describing activity towards describing a really clear, purposeful approach. And here we can see, I guess, a summary: stronger emphasis on growth, clearer expectations around articulation of strategy and your accountability for how you spend that money. Excuse me, and it is less about listing activity and more about explaining the contribution that you will make through that work. And that, I think, cues up, I guess, the challenge for us and the thing that I'll talk about today. How do we explain how our work contributes to growth without narrowing our mission or oversimplifying what we do? And I think that's the job really for the next 20 minutes or so, just think about how to do that. So how does growth happen, and how does knowledge contribute to growth? Taking this model that UKRI are proposing, it's a really interesting question, and it's a question, frankly, that all the big policy drivers at the moment are inviting us to be able to answer. So we've got HEIF, it's very much about how knowledge can be mobilized to improve lives and in particular drive growth. We've got the REF, which is very much about advancing knowledge and also talking about the engagement and impact that creates value for society. And the white paper too, the skills white paper that was published last year, is also really clear about how universities can contribute knowledge, skills, education, development into the places where they're located as well. So we'll come back to that. A lovely simple way of looking at this might be this: knowledge, skills and capabilities contribute, competitiveness and productivity increases, and growth is realized. It would be lovely if it were that simple, but I think we all know that it is a lot more tangled, a lot more iterative, more complicated than that. And the points I've put on the left-hand side, I think, indicate what can go wrong and how that simple, lovely, clear sense of knowledge translating into growth is actually much more complex in practice. So, for instance, innovations are not taken up, trusted, or used by people. Organizations and people lack skills or so-called absorptive capacity to actually engage with that knowledge. Public resistance slows or blocks delivery, and there are many examples of that, not least back in the early 2000s, genetically modified crops, for instance, and organisms, which was seen as one of the most sort of critical breakdowns in trust between the public and science. And of course, the final point about benefits concentrating for few places or for few people, the lack of inclusion in how that growth is actually experienced, all of which are challenges, really significant challenges, and challenges which the HEIF accountability statement is expecting people to be able to answer. And this is an attempt to just summarize what that might mean in practice, really. Those four areas that I put on the previous slide, you could summarize as pathways to growth, pathways where things can go wrong if engagement isn't done wisely and well. So legitimacy and trust, what can constrain growth in practice, public resistance, how public engagement can contribute in terms of building trust, connecting, confidence, and social license. The second area, adoption, innovation's not being taken up or trusted or used. And so much good engagement practice is very much about aligning solutions with real needs and really engaging with people around the development of new products or services. It's improving usability, of course. It's also, again, helping to make that research more trustworthy. Capability, the lack of organizational skills, individual skills, engagement helping with skills and learning and readiness, and also connection, building bridges, building connections, building networks with community and between communities and other organizations in place. And the final area, place and inclusion, really trying not only to think about who is benefiting, but also where that benefit is spreading and ensuring a really strong place focus, which is something the white paper is also emphasizing as important. So this sits, I think, very firmly underneath those four mechanisms that are at the heart of the logic model. Legitimacy and trust really helping with that first mechanism, adoption with the scaling of knowledge, capability with the support for organizations, and place and inclusion with enabling people to participate and engage. So I think it's clear there is a significant contribution for public engagement in the mechanisms. I just want to turn now to the inputs. There's another really critical link in the chain, which is to shift attention back to the beginning of the logic model, which is about the inputs to knowledge exchange, to the mechanisms which ultimately will achieve growth. And those five areas listed on the left are all areas that, again, we have strong evidence and lots of expertise in demonstrating the contribution that public engagement can make. In relation to research, great, it's generating ideas, evidence, and innovation, but engagement helps with the adoption of those and their alignment with real needs and with building trust. Education and skills, another fantastic input, building human capital productivity, but of course there's a whole set of issues around confidence, around participation, around pathways into opportunity, and knowledge exchange funding can really help to address those with a strong public and community engagement perspective. There's the third area, the people, carrying knowledge, creativity, relationships. But again, so much of the work in public, community and civic engagement is around people and around building capability and connection. In terms of facilities, equipment, data, tools, broadening access, and social networks and partnerships, coming back again to the need for better connection to sustain, build partnership connection, which helps create the conditions for knowledge to begin to percolate, to activate, and to make change happen. So coming back to where we started, which is this sort of simple logic model, I think what I've suggested is that there's quite a complex story to weave beneath that. And I think it's also fair to say that this is deliberately simple in how the guidance frames it, and it's based upon a much more detailed and more kind of sophisticated model of how knowledge exchange works. There's various publications that have explored and evaluated the pathways through which knowledge exchange creates value. This example, the evaluation of HEIF between 2008 and 2020, I think makes absolutely clear those pathways I've talked about are frankly real characteristics of high value knowledge exchange, and they underpin and are sort of motivated by that longer, more complex theory of change I just showed, which sits within this report as well. So a few quotes: knowledge exchange is complex, not linear or easily measured, is a point made in this evaluation. The value extends far beyond traditional return on investment metrics. This is about addressing societal challenges through collaboration, and needing quite sophisticated evaluation of those outcomes is just a given, according to this very helpful report. It talks about legitimacy and trust and how public policy engagement can result in greater policy influence and contribute to more effective outcomes. It talks about adoption, where enhanced knowledge exchange networks lead to increased public engagement with research, because well-developed networks improve the visibility and accessibility of research outputs, encouraging greater participation and use. So again, you could say that, see the same kind of logic being spelt out. It talks about capability, addressing regional skill gaps, readiness to engage, and it talks about place and inclusion and about tailoring projects to place-based challenges. So I think really strong, useful underpinning evidence. And as I say, the top level logic model, I think, is a deliberate simplification, but it invites these kinds of sort of more sophisticated stories to be told. Where you tell those stories is in the accountability statement. The second section of this webinar is actually looking at that in some detail. And those of you who went to the Research England briefing about the HEIF accountability will recognise this slide. It very helpfully breaks down the 5 sections of the accountability statement, starting with the strategic objectives, moving to equality, diversity and inclusion. Section 3 about the strategic objectives, which is where you flesh out the sort of real meat of what you're planning to do. 4, the oversight and governance, and 5, just the finance plan, how you're going to spend the money. And what I'm going to do is just pick the first 3 of these to look at in a bit more detail. Starting with strategic objectives, and this is inviting you to be clear about the strategic choices you're making and to talk about the growth dynamics that matter most in your context and the main constraints or risks to growth. I think those are really important questions, because depending on where your work is taking place, depending on the context, the demographics, the existing partnerships, the local government governance and sort of strength of networks and participation will affect how you can influence growth. And public engagement can help here in terms of addressing those constraints linked to adoption, trust, participation and coordination, and create the conditions for that growth objective to be realised more effectively. In terms of equality, diversity and inclusion, this is inviting you to be clear about who is currently participating and who is excluded, and which groups or places are underserved, to show that you've got a real grip on that, you're taking account of that, and public engagement has a really significant role to play there in terms of widening participation, building confidence, creating inclusive pathways into skills, etc. And then the third area I'll come back to in a minute is related to the actual activities you are going to invest the money in. And I think what we'll look at shortly is actually how you make the case for particular kinds of public community civic engagement activity, because it is supporting that move and that drive towards growth. So let's stick with the first one, the strategic objectives. And again, if you went to the Research England briefing, you'll have seen this slide. And I love that question. Um, what makes you special? This is not assuming there is some one size fits all approach to driving economic growth. It's really inviting you to be explicit and as clear as possible about your context and the rationale for how you do and why you do what you do. It's inviting you to think really clearly about your unique strengths or specialisms that underpin the approach and very much the drivers, the mission of your institution, but the economic context and the history behind the work that you're doing, and expressing those clearly in terms of objectives. And what that results in, I think it's very clear, is an expectation that those accountability statements will tell very different kinds of stories about the growth plan for the work that you're describing. And this is an example I like. This is an example of a growth plan. This isn't from a university. This is from a partnership in Greater Manchester. It sets out their 5-year vision for growth. And it's what you might call an inclusive growth narrative, a thriving city region where everyone can live a good life, where the economy is growing, but around that are a number of other work streams and related impacts that create an overarching kind of strategic frame for saying this is how we will get good growth here. And that's the story I think that's being invited in that strategic objective overview. And I think that's one kind of narrative, but I think it's important to think of this as what is our growth story. And here you can see four very simple, kind of almost archetypal narratives about growth. The first, perhaps you're leaning towards a kind of capability-led growth narrative, which is built through skills and learning and institutional strength. That's how you increase competitiveness. Your productivity is depending on people's ability to use that knowledge effectively. The growth will happen over time as capabilities accumulate. I don't think anyone would be particularly convinced by claiming that you're going to achieve quick wins necessarily, but you might be investing long term to create those conditions. And that's a storyline where public engagement can particularly contribute capability and participation. The second storyline is around what you might call adoption-led growth, which is more focused on how products, ideas, services get taken up, and very much shaped by the fit, the usability, and the trust with which the relationships with users of those outputs is underpinned by. And this growth happens when innovation is actually used at scale. So you cannot assume that these innovations will be used. You have to invest in that adoption-led approach. So this storyline takes you down the adoption and legitimacy pathway. And you can tell, I think, as I'm going through these, that actually it's not that simple. You'll probably be drawing on all of these in different ways to thread together a narrative. But I think it's quite helpful to break them down. The third looks at place-led or inclusive growth, which is very much that Manchester model that I shared with you. And then the fourth is perhaps where you might go for more of a balanced hybrid approach, which I suspect is where many people will land. And I hope these are useful. They give a sort of an overarching frame from which very clear objectives might be set. The next area is equality, diversity and inclusion, which is very much territory that people who work in this space are very familiar with. And that kind of prompt question about the choice about who, the challenge, who currently participates, who's excluded, which groups or places are underserved. There's a clear role for public and community engagement there. And going back to how Research England framed this, they said, how do you prevent barriers to participation in knowledge exchange? A real invitation, I think, to show how those barriers are being addressed through appropriate and responsible and ethical approaches to knowledge exchange. And I think all of you will be familiar with frames for thinking about responsibility in relation to innovation and growth. And this is one example we like very much. It's developed by the School of Social Sciences at Oxford University. It's got the lovely catchy title of Responsible Knowledge Exchange, Engagement and Impact, RKEEI, and it identifies 6 principles which are proven to underpin responsible practice and which would allow you to demonstrate that you are taking really seriously the objective of section 2. The third area, and the last one I'm going to look at this morning, is activities and outcomes. This is where you tell a very clear story about what you're planning to do and why, and it'll build upon those strategic objectives, and it will embody your approach to EDI. But where will you concentrate your investment and at what sort of scale? And here is the opportunity to tell engagement related stories in terms of those pathways. And again, going back to the Research England overview of the new accountability statement, it's very useful to see that they offered as a worked example one particular pathway from an art specialist university, which is very much in the space of creating inclusive growth. And it talks about a 2-day festival and a year-long engagement series, and it spells out in some detail how that could be expressed in the accountability statement. You'll notice that they're interested in intended outcomes, and many of us in the room will be very familiar with crafting these kinds of outcomes which demonstrate and can be evaluated to show how an intervent's had the kinds of effects that we want it to have. So that's a good example. I think we just spent a little bit of time going back over KEF, public and community engagement narratives, and HEIF case studies that are shared on the UKRI site. And we found sort of lots of examples of the kinds of pathways that you might include. And these quotes just are linked to those 4 areas where public engagement can contribute. The kind of things that people are already doing, that they're familiar with being able to plan well, to evaluate and to describe. So I'm going to move finally to just a few reflections on how does this all kind of come together. And I want to go back to the question that was posed right at the beginning by people coming to the event, which was, I guess, how to make the case for public and community engagement at a time when so much is shifting in funding policy and where there is this particular emphasis on economic growth. And this is just a quote from the chief exec of UKRI, who was speaking earlier this week on the 3rd of February to the Science, Technology and Innovation Committee, where he described this advancing knowledge, improving lives, driving growth framing. And he framed it like this. He framed it in terms of what do the electorate want from us. And he said, we have the privilege to spend £10 billion of taxpayers' money to get a return for the economy, to improve people's lives and to drive growth. That's what the electorate want from us. And we need to be clear-eyed on our mission and actually focus on delivering those outcomes. And I think that is a strong call to action for us to make the case for how public, community and civic engagement is fundamental to achieving those goals and creating value that everyone in the UK can benefit from. And if you look across these different policy instruments, I think it is just quite helpful to try to elicit from them some kind of common frame of reference for what is shifting. And I think you could argue that across UKRI strategy as a whole, the REF, HEIF, and the Skills and Post-16 white paper is definitely a kind of a shift of emphasis to what you might call socially situated knowledge that is shaped through engagement with people, organisations and places. UKRI strategy really understanding knowledge now as something that is creating value when it's used and trusted and connected to real world contexts. And public engagement clearly helps massively with that. The REF, I think, is again really emphasizing engagement, contribution and connection and strategy. being really intentional about how you activate the potential of research. HEIF, I think, offers the opportunity to tell that same story. And the skills white paper again focuses on, I guess, what you might call place-based learning systems, where participation, progression, lifelong learning, local connection are all part of the story, and engagement again has a significant role to play. So this is where we'll pause and end today, I think, with this overview and this invitation to think about the potential to thread stories around public and community engagement right into the heart of your HEIF accountability statement. What we are producing to go alongside this webinar is a short toolkit of just advice, resources, and worked examples based upon the ideas that I've shared in this webinar that you might choose to adapt in how you prepare your accountability statement. So thank you for listening. I hope this has been useful. Do please download the slides and take a look at the resource pack, which I hope will help you in your preparation. And do stay in touch with us. We'd be really interested to hear stories from people about how this is working and how you are managing to thread this complex story together. Thank you.